Support for Local Bias is provided by Dawn's School of Dance, Hope Street, Greenfield. Federal Street Books. Expand your mind. The Rendezvous, 78 3rd Street, Turners Falls. Foster's Supermarket, 70 Allen Street, Greenfield. The Greenfield Solar Store on Fisk Avenue. Hi, I'm Drew Hutchison. You're tuned to Local Bias. We come to you from the studios of Greenfield Community Television at 393 Main Street in Greenfield. And as much as I love doing my own show, I encourage viewers to get involved in GCTV. They can do their own show because there are wonderful people at Greenfield Community Television, such as Philippe Simon, my guest today, who can train you. Philippe, welcome to the show.
Nice to be here. So it's a real pleasure.
It's a pleasure and an honor to have you on, and you are so helpful, but that's not why you're here today, not in your capacity as Mr. Everything here at GCTV. You're here as a co-chair of the Human Rights Commission?
The chairperson.
The chairperson, okay. So you're the chairperson, and so how's it going?
Well, it's been going pretty incredible, pretty intense right now. We're getting a lot of calls. People need resources to help their teachers, for instance. A few teachers have called and needed some resources about how to teach their students about civil behavior, about diversity, and about the sexualization of teenagers through social media. We've gotten a few complaints, not very many, about discriminatory things that happen here in Greenfield.
Now, is this something that you think is related to the climate, the macro climate in the country because of this divisive electoral season we just had?
Well, I certainly will say this. During my first meeting, and keeping in mind that we had been aware of a massive increase in the number of hate crimes, not only leading up to the election, but proceeding directly afterwards.
Right.
And so when we had our first meeting after the November 8th election, I asked every one of the commissioners to be open, to be proactive, to be alert and available for the public, and to keep an eye on the town to make sure that these things don't happen here.
And actually, one of the successes of the Human Rights Commission is the very fact that people know to turn to you, because the commission hasn't been around all that long. When was it founded?
I believe it was founded maybe about 5 or 10 years ago. Yeah.
Right.
So it's something, I don't have the exact date.
Right. Well, you weren't living in Greenfield until a few years ago.
Exactly.
yourself.
Exactly. I'm newer to Greenfield. I've been in this Western Mass area since 2001.
Right.
And I think one of the things that makes the Human Rights Commission so effective is the fact that we are open to the public. Mm-hmm. We open our meetings up. We have a lot of public forums. People can come and speak to us. We have gone out into the community. I especially, when I became the new chairperson, went out into the community and just let people know that I am available for you. And that I will do what I can.
So has that one-on-one outreach where you're just talking to people, has that made a difference? Have you noticed, have people come to your meetings after you've just, hey, we have this going on, and they're showing up?
I talk to a lot of different resource groups, groups that are interested in social justice, as well as individuals, and said, why don't you consider having a representative from your group come to every one of the meetings so that they can talk about some of the issues that they're dealing with? Because a lot of what we do is educational. We don't have a mandate to discipline people, or we're not a punitive organization. So we advise the mayor, we advise the town on good practices, things that will help people understand and accept diversity in Greenfield.
And your meetings, I mean, are there, you read about them all the time. The Recorder does a really good job of covering
the Recorder has been fantastic, especially in some of the issues that we had to deal with this last summer.
Okay, and so,
They've also encouraged me to write more my turns and more
Okay.
columns so that I can continue to educate people. They've been very receptive.
but does the education even work? And I know that's kind of cynical for me to say, but it seems like we've been evolving over time. I mean, we have gay marriage now, whereas 20 years ago, no one thought that would happen. So there are certainly some successes. I mean, I feel that's a success. But yet, this last election season and the election of Donald Trump and the putting in place of white supremacists in positions of authority and power, it's almost like we've lifted this rock and all these ugly people are coming out, but they were there. It's not like they had gone away. And haven't we been educating people all along anyway? Does the education, will a white supremacist actually understand the education if it's offered?
Perhaps not the hardcore white supremacists, perhaps not the people who gain power from that type of thing, but for the victims.
Okay.
Which I include the people who follow that ideology,
Right.
Unknowingly and wrongly. For them, a lot of times they're looking for an answer. They're looking for an education.
Right.
They're looking for the ideology and the thinking, but they're not getting it. They're not getting it from the mainstream media, which focuses on sensationalism.
Right.
They're not getting it from mainstream programming because that focuses on entertainment and not education.
Right.
And there seems to be a lot more of an ethos that promotes frivolity and sexuality and those types of things rather than gaining people insight. So I think that if we keep the education up, there are so many things that are out there to teach people that have been forgotten.
Okay, so
There are things that we taught people 20 years ago that have been forgotten today.
like what?
Well, for instance, a lot of people wanted to know what the harm was of the Confederate flag.
Okay.
And I wanted to discuss it, or at least regard it as a symbol of white supremacy.
Right.
And so I dealt with the issue of white supremacy. And I recently, last summer, wrote an article for the Recorder in the My Turn section. And I wrote about the history of the South a little bit. And I focused in on Alabama. And where a lot of people might think that racism or the Ku Klux Klan or white supremacy movements might benefit white people, it absolutely harms white people.
Right.
And it's toxic and absolutely dangerous and harmful to people of color, but it also hurts white people. I did a study, a little bit of research, and I looked at the 1901 Alabama Constitutional Convention, which is a pivotal convention because it focused in on creating the laws and the standards for polling for the elections.
Okay.
So all of a sudden there were educational requirements and there was a poll tax.
Right.
Keep in mind too, the poll tax was, I think, $1 less a year than what your average white farmer would make.
Right.
A poor individual
it didn't just
farmer.
disenfranchise the blacks, it disenfranchised anyone who wasn't a wealthy property owner.
So I thought what was also interesting about that is that there was a minority dissent in that said that if we try to create a poll tax and an educational requirement, we are de facto eliminating African Americans from the voting rolls.
Mm-hmm. But isn't that what they wanted to do?
And then that was what was, the minority said that was unconstitutional.
Right.
I thought it was really interesting because the Minority Report was issued by 5 former Confederate officers, majors and generals,
Seriously?
who had fought in the war, but then believed that they should honor the Constitution.
Right.
It passed anyway.
Well, and eventually it was overturned with the civil rights legislation that occurred, half a
Well,
century
it passed
later.
in 1901, and the state of Alabama did a census in 1942. So this is 40 years afterwards. So it's a good amount of time to see what kind of an effect something like that had. And what they found was that 600,000 white voters and 520,000 black voters have been disenfranchised through that process. So as you can see, although it was over 90% of the black vote had been stifled, and only 37% of the white vote, it still makes a big difference.
That's right.
That's a huge voting block, and that virtually eliminated the radical Republican rule in the South. Obviously the civil rights movement has overturned a lot of that.
But we've been moving backwards.
Frank McGinnis, who was a federal judge in Alabama, was the one who also ruled in favor of Rosa Parks, for instance. And Montgomery, Alabama is the home of the Southern Poverty Law Center,
Right.
who does an incredible job with exposing hate crimes and hate groups and then suing them out of existence.
Right, and
They've
they
done
don't
a great
take
job
any.
with that.
They don't take any funds from the government or from anybody. It's all through donations.
Exactly.
And when they go to trial, they don't take the winnings from the trial. They work pro bono. So I mean, there's a lot to speak for the.
Right, and
Southern
that
Poverty Law
they
Center.
can maintain their objectivity that way.
That's right.
And right now, also in Alabama, and since 2014, I believe, maybe even earlier, there's been a lot of talk about looking at the whole Constitution of Alabama. It's one of the longest constitutions of any state. And to give it a complete overhaul, instead of amending it and fixing it, it might just need to be completely overhauled. So they're looking at that now, and I think that's significant. And although the things that happened in this last election might make one believe that we live in a very racist country, I think that that's contrary to what the reality is. I think a lot of people voted for Donald Trump because they were looking for someone who was addressing what their whole problem was.
Right.
The state of the American working class, black and white, is immiserated right now. Decades of union busting, decades of companies leaving the country, and only recently things like worker-owned cooperatives popping up into existence. So there's been a great immiseration of people. They're wondering why they're working at a retail job for minimum wage rather than a $20 to $30 an hour union job that's family supportive, community building type of job.
Right.
And in the absence, and I think a lot of more people would have voted for Hillary Clinton, but when she said something like, Donald Trump said, "Make America strong," or "Make America great," and she said, "Well, America's already great." That showed people that she wasn't really looking at what the problems were, and they felt alienated.
Well,
but for some reason, they forgot the racism and sexism that had been coming out of the candidate, Trump.
I don't know if they took it seriously.
They may not have taken it seriously, but what they did here was like, "I want to help the little guy."
And
so
he
people are
said
looking
he was
for
going
that.
to drain the swamp, and so of course he turns to Goldman Sachs, and I mean he's gone back on his word already so much. But I mean, I'm not surprised by that.
I want to keep an eye on this presidency and see what it has to offer,
Right.
in an objective fashion, and continue the work locally. One of the things that has really empowered people lately, and one of the things that we've seen, and people have come back and told us a lot of stories, is the incredible amount of people that have come out and protested.
Right. Well, it has energized. Maybe it's waken a sleeping giant. And the sad fact is, both candidates are the most unpopular candidates to ever run for the office, and half the people didn't even show up to vote. So you have 25% of the people who are deciding what form of government we have for the rest of us.
That was like the 1980 election where 27% of the population voted. As Gil Scott-Heron, the famous blues and soul artist, said, people voted for no one for president, meaning they didn't want any president in that sense. But what that really does tell us is that there's a huge alienation from the political system.
Well, and I think the answer to that alienation is that people need to understand that it's, they show up, for instance, for the presidential elections because that's the one that piques their interest. But I would say far more important are who you vote for locally. And if you get involved locally and you join your precinct and you join your local Republican or Democratic Party or whatever party, then you have a voice in your community. You get to know the process, because it's not that all of a sudden a certain person is elected and they can make all the difference. They're a figurehead. A president is a figurehead. They can set an agenda, they can set a tone, but they can't do anything without support from the people.
Exactly. And right now there's a lot of avenues for that activism. There is, yes, being involved in your local politics, being involved in your local community, being involved in social justice groups, and also being involved in the protests that are happening. The media, for instance, reported that 8,000 to 10,000 people marched in New York, but people who come back say that the number was probably closer to 15,000.
Okay.
So it's a lot bigger than what even some people are being told right now.
Right.
And I think that that's significant. And we have to look at the media, which really fueled what happened in the election, as having some kind of responsibility.
Well, and I think as much as the media did a deplorable job using that deplorable language, they treated it as a horse race and as a novelty. And it's like, what is he going to say next? For instance, if you take into account the amount of coverage that Donald Trump received and compare it side by side with Bernie Sanders, Bernie had far more people showing up to his rallies, and yet he received almost no time in major media. The WikiLeaks.
Well, this has happened before.
This has happened before.
Look at the 1910 election with Eugene Debs. He did incredible, but this country is very afraid of socialists.
Right, and so the newspapers at that time were, we didn't have as much consolidation back then, but by the same token, the newspapers were still owned by men of means, and he was espousing a philosophy.
And so, as a Human Rights Commission chairman, this is something that I have to be aware of, is that looking at how the national media withholds a lot of information from people. It's supposed to be a tool for people to make the right decisions in their lives.
Well, and that's one reason why, thankfully we do have local cable access, and one of the great benefits of it is, for instance, you can read the recorder and see what they have to say about the latest town council meeting or the latest school committee meeting. But if you really want to know yourself, you can actually watch that meeting at gctv.org or watch it when it comes up during the regular programming.
We film as many of those public meetings as we possibly can. From the planning board to the Human Rights Commission to the town council and the school committee and the Ways and Means Committee. All of that stuff is available online if they don't have the time to actually, go to the schedule and watch it when it actually airs on GCTV. Also, through the community coverage,
right.
GCTV will focus in on a lot of the main issues of the day and try to get those people in to tell their story.
Well, and what's one of the primary responsibilities you have is you create these news stories, and unlike watching Channel 22 or 40, which are professional organizations and do a great job in what they do, their stories are 30 seconds long or a minute long. The stories that you do are how long?
We are trying so hard, people, and I hope you can be patient, to keep these down to 5 minutes or less.
But 5 minutes is an eternity.
5 minutes is nothing when you start listening to the story that some of these people have to tell. But yes, it's an eternity for some people. So there's a problem. There's a problem with the brain, and there's a problem with education where people are getting so used to being blasted by the media.
We have a shorter attention span.
That they'll look at the headline and react to that rather than look at the headline and use that as an impetus to actually want to investigate. So people need to start learning how to turn on the critical part of their mind. GCTV and other community media stations and services are struggling right now to figure out a way to do that.
Well,
how do you present the news story in a way that actually entices people to want to investigate further? Well, it's hard for me to understand. I'm the type of person. I went to the type of school that engaged my critical thinking, made it as to read a book, to not know something and say, hey, I want to know about that.
Right.
That's like a hobby of mine, and not everybody's like that, and it's hard for me to realize and appreciate. So I've got to do as much as I can.
Well, in a recent study, and I don't know where it's from, so this is hearsay, showed that young people especially do not know when they are receiving misinformation. And a case in point is, if you take a look at Facebook and the type of news and links that are being shared on Facebook, and I've been guilty of this. I shared something the other day about Monsanto and glyphosate, Roundup showing up in different types of, well, it was not true. But because I believed it likely, confirmation bias, that's true, rather than researching it myself. Now, fortunately, there were some alert readers that said, Drew, you got to look this up, and this is not actually factual.
Yeah.
But I'm thankful that I have friends like that, and I think we need to do that more and more often.
Yeah.
You can't just accept that because it shows up on a website somewhere, just because Alex Jones says it, or some teenage hacker in Macedonia says it.
Well, hey, let's make an appeal to young people and people of all ages and all walks of life to spend a little bit of time, a little less time, inebriating themselves or looking away into a fantasy world and try to explore the amazingness and the excitement of what reality has to offer and what learning has to offer. I'll just give you a quick example because I love to talk about myself. One of the reasons why I'm on your show.
Go for it.
I decided one day I did not know enough about modern African history from the colonial, after the colonial era to the present day. I knew a lot of things, but I didn't really have as much of an understanding as I wanted to have. And you know, being a reggae musician as well, there are a lot of people out here in Western Mass who are African, who are in the reggae music industry. And so it honors them as well. And so I started going down, and Wikipedia is so easy. It takes you like...
No, even Wikipedia is not a primary source.
Right, but it's a basic
It's a great
way of getting to learn some facts and figures, some names, a little bit of history, a little bit of the culture, and then you can investigate further. So I started with the letter A, and by the time I got to B-U-R, I had looked up this country, Burkina Faso, which is hardly known by anybody. It was a former French colony right in the middle of West Africa. It's landlocked. It used to be called Upper Volta, and they were really happy to change that name. Because Burkina Faso means the land of the upright man. And so it has a beautiful meaning, and the Burkinabe are the people who live there. There are the Maasai and Fulani and a few other ethnic groups, but mostly it's the Burkinabe. And I found out that this guy, Thomas Sankara, had been the president from 1983 to 1987. He was a Marxist, he was a revolutionary. He came into office, he virtually eliminated hunger and poverty in a very short period of time. He got the country involved in everybody rolling up their sleeves and taking part in infrastructure projects. People built their own railway by hand. You know, they weren't getting any kind of funding at all. It was the first country in Africa, even by the 1980s, where there was an active effort to include women in the government. And not just like the Ministry of Homes or the Ministry of Cookery or something like that. These women got important high-level cabinet positions. And he also made forced marriage and genital mutilation illegal. And that was back in the 80s. And these are things that we're struggling with now. So he was assassinated, funded by most likely the French bankers who wanted to keep, who are now still sucking money out of that part of Africa and immiserating it. And the person who took over from him, Blaise Compaoré, ruled for 27 years.
As a despot, probably.
As a despot, and just kept getting himself reelected for some odd reason. And recently the people had a huge uprising. Although they burned tires and shut down the Parliament building, there wasn't really all that much violence. But they made a very strong statement. They had an election, and the African Union supervised it. So now the Sankarist parties, those progressive left-wing parties, are back in dealing with these issues.
Well, and that's great if you're progressive and for Burkina Faso. But if you take a look at what's going on in Europe and in this country, it seems that the progressives.
But the point is like, how would I have known that if I hadn't stopped and said, what do I?
You continue to grow and educate yourself. And in fact, that love of learning, that's what we need to be imparting to children. It's not giving them a particular fact. It's letting them know that, look, you're never going to be done learning. You can't know everything. So why would you ever stop learning? Because there's always something more, and it's all so fascinating. So that joy of learning something and delving into it, we need to create that. We need to inspire kids because that empowers them.
And a lot of that can happen at home. A lot of that does not happen in school because the teachers have their requirements that they've got to get out. I will not even talk about how they're driven to those requirements. But again, back into my own childhood. I went to school at the age of 6, and my first grade teacher told us that we were at war in Vietnam and that the United States Marines were going to go over there, and we were trying to fight against communism and help the South Vietnamese government. And so I went home to my mom and I said, Mom, I wish I was 16 instead of 6 so I could join the Marines and kill the communists. And she said, why don't you start watching the news with me?
Right.
And start watching some of the special reports in the news.
Well, back then the news actually covered what was going on.
And then here's the encyclopedia. Why don't you
Right.
do a little research? So I did, and I found out that the way that I had been taught to perceive that conflict was completely different than what was actually going on there. So it was a very complicated thing.
But you talk about the media. For instance, when Walter Cronkite basically
It was so different back then.
came out against the war, you know, Richard Nixon said, well, we've lost Walter Cronkite, we've lost.
Uh-huh.
And of course, with the Iraq War.
Do you see any footage coming home from there?
Well, no. With
Do you
all the
see
reporters,
cameramen in
they were
Afghanistan?
embedded
No.
with our media were embedded with the invasion force. They were working as propagandists, basically, on behalf of the United States government.
I decided that I was against the Vietnam War when I saw that footage of the 2 children running from their village with their skins torn from napalm.
Right.
I said, I can't believe that this has to affect children like this. I thought that war was an adult thing.
Right.
And I had no idea. And I learned that, and I said that that's wrong. And then that was confirmed with another news story. This is the importance of the media. There was a newsman right in behind the sandbags with a couple of Marines or Army, I'm not sure which branch they were in. And there's a guy firing over the sandbags, ducking his head down and cursing and yelling about how this is like crazy, and that I can't even use the language here, but and how all he wanted to do was go home and go back to school.
Right.
He's tired of losing his buddies in the war, and it just seemed unwinnable.
Well, and the thing is, there was the draft back then, but the draft was unequal because you had people like Dick Cheney who could, and Donald Trump, who could do deferments or can get out of it, especially the college educated. They found ways to avoid going to war.
Well, it's been like that in the United States for a long time. The Civil War was a great example of that as well.
Right.
Is that the $300 that you needed to stay out of the draft didn't apply to the Irish in New York, didn't apply to other poor people, and it helped them to resent that.
Right.
Which is a tragedy, because growing up in Boston, I've always seen the struggle of the black working class and the Irish working class as being synonymous, whether or not in Boston that was perceived that way.
Well, no, actually, I think that the Irish resented the blacks and vice versa. I mean, if you take a look at the integration issues that they had and the busing issues.
Well, let's take a look at that whole string of events.
Sure.
When I went to school, I volunteered to go to a school in Roxbury, which is a black section of Boston. And it was a subsystem school. It was brand new. It was named after William Monroe Trotter, who was a black editor in Boston. And it was an integrated school, though white kids were the minority by far. And that was just such an incredible experience and such a beneficial experience. And the kids were really cool.
Right.
They were really nice. I remember coming into the playground, and some kid goes, "Hey, who's the white boy?" And another kid immediately, without me even being able to say, I was fine with that. I know I'm a white boy. I'm like, and you know, I looked very different from everybody else in my school, and I was ready to say, well, here's my name and let's play together.
Right.
But before I could even do that, the other kid was like, "Hey, we don't do that. We don't say that. We don't call people that stuff."
Right.
And so we just started playing together, and we were just kids.
I believe we're receiving the signal to start closing the show. Is that correct, Director? I couldn't see over there because
Okay, well, let me just say one more thing.
Go ahead, please.
I just want everybody in Greenfield to know that the Greenfield Human Rights Commission is going to be engaged in not only diversity issues, but also poverty issues, disability issues, bullying issues, anything that constitutes a human right. And we want to let everybody know that they are welcome to come to our meetings at the second Monday of every month at 114 Main Street Planning Office, and that they are welcome to come and speak.
Very good. Well,
I believe the next meeting that we have, we're going to be looking into and perhaps even having a public forum for people to share ideas about what is a sanctuary city, what is a safe zone.
Okay.
Do we need that in Greenfield?
now, this show is going to air the whole month of December.
Great.
So the dates that you're giving may not necessarily apply for a particular forum.
Right.
But nonetheless, it's important, the work that you're doing, and people can show up and they can contact you here at GCTV if they even need to. So
Well, the town hall has my
Or
phone
town
number
hall,
and my
okay.
email address, and I'm open to everybody.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank
I
you
really
so much,
appreciate it.
Drew. It's such a pleasure to
love
be on
you.
the show with you.
I'm Drew Hutchison. Thank you for tuning in to Local Bias. Take care.